hey, this one isn't about politics, don't leave. Still here? Cool. So, I've been thinking about how there's so much effort that goes into the videos I do about politics, and in addition to my home life and my work life, that's just a lot of things that take a lot of effort. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to make videos to also talk about something else. And it took me a while. I was sort of racking my brain for what I could talk about. Science is what I do. It's a lot of what I know. Politics is a lot of what I pay attention to. And so I was in a sort of zone where I couldn't figure out what to talk about. But then I sort of thought about if I had to pick something else, if there was anything else that I knew a fair amount about, what was that? Well, that happens to be scary movies, scary TV shows, horror movies, horror TV shows. This is my favorite genre of entertainment. I mean, I love fantasy, don't get me wrong, but if you were to look at my collection of DVDs, if you were to look at my Netflix queue, if you were to look at the books I own, what you're going to find is that the majority, the vast majority, are horror. So, I figure I can talk about that. Because it is something I know. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not one of those people who has a lot of sort of high knowledge of directors and writers and producers and actors. I do have some of that, but that's all stuff I've acquired sort of accidentally. Where I do know a lot is about the actual films themselves. And so I want to talk on this video about why I love horror. And then, moving forward, I'll try to make more of these semi-regularly. Maybe I'll stack my political content, so it's 1 week politics, 1 week not politics. But we'll see what happens moving forward. I want to go ahead and talk about why I love horror movies. I think the reason that I enjoy them is actually really different from why a lot of other people like them. So, for me, there is something deeper in them than just the substance of what we see, right? Even a bad horror movie. So I think you can break horror down, or at least I do, into two general groups. And the first one is going to be things that are supernatural. This is your Nightmare on Elm Street. This is your Friday the 13th. Everything past the initial one. This is debatable. Your Halloween movies. It really does sort of depend on where you are in the franchise and how much disbelief you can suspend. Then you've got your natural. This is your Scream. This is your Psycho. This is your American Psycho. This is a group of things where it's very normal. And I will say, I generally tend to put science-based horror in the supernatural. That's me, and I usually do that because it's pretty unrealistic. So some things can be, but they tend not to be. So those land in the supernatural bucket. And the reason that I like horror is not, I think, the normal reason that people do. For me, even in a bad horror movie, even in what people will call a bad horror movie, and I will be the first to admit that my taste is very different from a lot of people. But even in what is called a bad horror movie, you get something really, really important, especially on the supernatural side. And what that is a very intricate world building, or at least an implied world behind what you're seeing. And I'll give you an example from two different movies. So the first one is one that's pretty popular, It Follows. Now, It Follows, obviously, there are going to be spoilers for anything I talk about here, so if you haven't seen it, don't watch this part. I'll try and timestamp something in the video so you can skip past it. But in It Follows, what happens is it's an allegory essentially for sexually transmitted diseases. You sleep with someone who is cursed by this thing, and then that curse transfers to you, and the curse has to go through you first to get to them. Now, the way the thing in It Follows works is that if you're not part of the curse, you can't see the thing. It's invisible to you. If you do have the curse, it can appear in a bunch of different ways, but it does have a very distinct MO. So it appears to only be able to walk, and it will go directly towards you. It can navigate around things, through things. It'll go through doors. It'll break through walls. But it tends to work within the normal bounds of what a person would do. Granted, it's super strong, but that's the thing in It Follows. And the greater sort of background in that I find really intriguing and really fun is that this is one of those horror monsters that appears to have distinct rules. That in this world, this thing has to travel on foot. It always knows where you are, and it is always heading towards you. If you sleep with someone else, the curse will transfer to them, and then it will do that to them first. And then it has to come to you through them. Now, when you think about this, there are a lot of fun thought exercises you can get out of this particular movie. Right? So, can the thing be trapped? Theoretically, you could trap it. Its level of strength is tricky, so you don't know how easily it could break out, but it appears to have to abide by the general rules and laws of physics. So you could maybe trap it. But even if you couldn't, could you avoid it indefinitely? How would you do that? So, say you know it's after you, you hop on a plane, you go to Europe. Does it walk across the seafloor to get to you? Or is it intelligent enough to get in a plane or on a boat to make it across? It's going to always know where you are, so it will follow you. But there are rules. There's something to play with in that universe. And so that's one reason why you can really enjoy a horror movie on the supernatural side. It gives you this sort of sandbox. And it usually doesn't have quite those defined rules. Although you will find that most franchise horror movies, most series of horror movies, do have some sort of interconnected threads or rules that they follow. For instance, in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, if you die in the dream, you die in real life. That if you wake up, you can bring Freddy out with you, and that there is a sort of power in your own imagination, in your mind. So there are rules. Now, the other example is a movie that I personally quite enjoy, but I do know that people are sort of off and on it, and that is 13 Ghosts. So, right now, let me be clear. Fucking love anything with Matthew Lillard in it. Guy is great in everything he does. Great movie. There's a lot of fucking lore in that one. And it's all much less on the surface, right? If you don't know, the movie is about a house filled with ghosts that have been trapped there in order to act as a sort of power source for a machine designed by the devil. There's more nuance to that, but that's the general vibe. And all the ghosts who are trapped are murderous ghosts. They were generally bad people in life, died, and stayed bad people in death. And this universe has rules. So there are spells, and whether written in Latin or spoken in Latin, ghosts have to obey what the spells say. These can be used to make barriers. They can be used to make them go to a certain place or go away from a certain place. And the big thing here is the heavy implication of this world, right? There's a very, very real sort of structure here that's implied by everything that happens, but that is not directly stated. So, one, there's for sure an afterlife in this universe, because there are ghosts. But we also have to look at ghosts are only made through events that are tragic or brutal. That's how a ghost is made, which means that there's some sort of switch or trigger or trip that is specific to bad experiences that makes a ghost, that makes something linger. It's also spoken in the movie that most ghosts are harmless. Can't see them, they don't interact with you. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. But tortured souls in life become stronger tortured souls in death. So aside from the fact that there are a lot more ghosts who, even on lesser circumstances, I suppose, will be brought into existence, there's some sort of power that is also conferred from both your living life and the way in which you die. Now, what you don't see in this movie is a counterbalance to that, right? You don't see, you have a machine that was designed by the devil, built by a madman, and in all of this, there's no real counterbalance. There's a protagonist's wife who is a ghost who may or may not have been violent. So I think the thing to be really sort of clear about is that Tony Shalhoub's wife, Tony Shalhoub the actor, that was not his name in the movie, but his wife was one of the ghosts. And she had died as a result of a house fire. Now, she was never violent with her own family, but would she have been with strangers? We don't know. The other ghosts had no connection and were quite violent, but this ghost was not. So does that mean that you hold on to enough of yourself to choose, or was she by default a non-violent ghost? Right? Really fucking interesting. But again, you lack, other than her, a sort of counterbalance. Like, well, if we've got ghosts, there should be something, counter to that, right? Except there's not. It's implied that if you die in a good way, if you're happy, if you've lived a good life, you don't show up. You're just gone. And so horror universes often provide, in the background, a mountain of lore that you could dig through, a mountain of implications that make those worlds so much more accidentally interesting than a lot of fantasy worlds are intentionally. Because I think what happens is that in fantasy, you start with the world. You make the world the way you want it. In horror, you start with the story. And you build that story to be the thing you want. And in the process of that happening, you set the outer bounds of those rules. You set a rough framework of what that looks like. And then you don't really generally dig past that if you're making it. Now, if you're making a series, you'll do a little bit more. Each time you sort of expand on the lore and expand on the world building. But it's always based on the story you're telling, the specific story. Whereas I think the primary difference between fantasy, which you can have the same effect, and horror is that in fantasy, the world building is first, and the stories are a part of the world building. But in horror, the stories are first, and the world building is a part of the story. So you don't dig into the history of everything, but you put a piece out there that helps you tell the story, and in so doing, create an interesting thing in the world. Horror is also one of the genres that most easily parodies itself. There is a lot of horror that is there's a lot of horror that is self-referential, that looks at what other horror does and either builds on that or does a play on it. You've got absolutely fantastic movies like Cabin in the Woods and Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, both of which are great movies that I love. And both of them seek to explain idiosyncrasies that you see in a horror movie. And I will separately say that those will be a different video where I talk specifically about them and specifically about what they try to do and why both of them, if you are a fan of horror, are absolutely phenomenal. But you can get mixed reactions from people who are just casual enjoyers. But horror often references itself and builds on this shared narrative where all horror tends to fold into a sort of umbrella that keeps it together. And now there are some differences. You have things like Saw, which is more of a torture genre. I would say The Collector and The Collection also land over there, although those are very good for their own reasons. But outside of that sort of clade of horror movies, there's a lot of self-referential things. The Fear Street series on Netflix, new one, Prom Night, comes out today, May 23rd. Very excited to watch that. But that whole series was very, very referential, not only of themselves, but also of other horror movies in the genre. A lot of it in terms of cinematography, music choices, set elements, all felt very, very well designed to pay an homage to other things in horror. And so there's a lot of nuance in there, but it tends to be self-referential. So if you're a fan of horror and you watch a lot of it, what you end up seeing is that a lot of it feels sort of like inside baseball. A lot of it feels like people in the know talking about the thing they know and building off of that. So like my wife and I have a mountain of inside jokes that are usually one-liners from movies or things we've said in our younger years that make no sense to anyone else. But between us, with just those couple of phrases or a few words, we can convey a bunch of meaning about something. We can have those little moments of connection that make us feel so close. And horror does that with people who watch a lot of it by inserting those things into movies. I think that there's also a much more sort of broad and free way about which people make horror movies. They tend to be lower budget than your big blockbusters. And so you get a lot more of them, which means you get a lot of variety in your horror movies. And because of that, there's just a mountain out there. And again, if you're like me, who generally doesn't recognize bad acting, the bad acting has to be pretty bad for me to notice it. But if you're like me, what you end up seeing is that most of it's passable. Most of the horror movie acting is passable, even when things are sort of slammed by Rotten Tomatoes. If you're there for a fun ride, you'll usually get the job done. And these worlds are, again, really, really interesting. And I think there's something to be said for a general theme in all of horror that I think will permeate every bit of it. In horror, what is evil is always at an advantage. It is always far stronger, far faster, far more meticulous, more planned out. It exists largely in a supernatural realm, even when it's a very natural type of horror. People are stronger. They can take more damage. They can survive things that other people couldn't. And what you often find is that the protagonist of your horror movie, or the protagonists, are at a disadvantage. The rest of the world doesn't believe what's happening. Even if they could, they don't. Even if they did believe it, they can't intervene. There's just nothing they can do. And so what ends up happening is that you have a group of people who are underpowered, who have to try and beat something much stronger, and generally something from outside the bounds of their familiarity. And because of that, horror is often a struggle that I think reflects real life in a very substantive way. I think when we look around at the problems we see in the world, all of them are so very big. And it feels like everyone is much stronger and much more pervasive than any one of us can deal with. And generally, the way someone will survive or succeed in a horror movie is through determination and through grit and toughness. They will continue going even when things seem hopeless. The people who survive in horror movies are the ones who see the bleak state of what they're in and do something about it. And I think that's a great lesson for life generally. Things might seem hopeless, but you can always keep doing something. You really lose when you give up. Because I get it, there are people in horror movies who don't give up, who die anyway, but to each of us, we are the protagonist of our story. And so it's important to remember that as the protagonist, you really only lose if you give up. Now, I know that's a general thing and it doesn't apply to everyone or everything, but it is, I feel like, a great message that's sort of hidden in the background of every horror movie. That the things that seek to hurt you are so much bigger than you. But you can still do something about it. Maybe you get together with your friends. Maybe you do something about it that way. Maybe you just keep on keeping on because that's what you can do. And so horror can provide hope, even in the darkest scenarios. At the end, a lot of horror is hopeful. Might take a minute to get there, and it does really depend on what movie you're talking about, because a lot don't end that way. But generally, we as people like to see a happy ending or a happier ending, even in horror. And so there are a lot where, even though things seem bleak or hopeless, it does end up working out. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love it so much. So, having said all that, what I will say is that I think the next thing I want to talk about with horror will be in the next video. And what I want to talk about is specifically Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, and Cabin in the Woods. So, if you haven't seen those, I suggest you do. Not just because they're great, but because I'll be talking about them much more in depth during that video. Because I think they are truly an encapsulation of everything that horror can be for an insider. And then I'll probably try to talk about a couple of horror movies that I think are just generally pretty great, whether or not you're in the genre. I hope this gave you something to think about. I hope you watch a couple of horror movies and maybe see the hope in them, or try and build that world out from the pieces they put in front of you. Because that's why I love it. So, take care, and talk to you next week.